Thank you very much, Guido. I can say that Guido's book is probably the most interesting and informative book that I can remember reading in many, many years. I do want to apologize to our audience, our off-site audience that's listening and watching on Mises.org, especially my friend Mrs. Bobby Ames and her students who are watching this morning on Mises.org. Our next author is Dr. Roderick Long. Roderick is a professor of philosophy here at Auburn University, and he's going to be discussing his new anthology on anarchist writers. Roderick?
Okay, so this is a book. It's an anthology that I co-edited with Tibor Machan called Anarchism/Minarchism is a Government Part of a Free Country. You might think that subtitle's a little awkward, but the publisher likes it, so it's great. The bad news is it costs $80. The moderately good news is that you can get a 20% discount with one of these flyers, which I'll put in a stack somewhere at some point. So one of the long-standing disputes in libertarian thought is exactly how much government do libertarians want to do away with? Do we take it down to the level of protection of individual rights, as the minarchists, that is, advocates of minimal government or the minimal state, would have it? Or should you go all the way to what's sometimes called anarcho-capitalism or free market anarchism, where you replace a monopoly government entirely with competing protection agencies on the free market or some such idea like that. Have economic transactions, market transactions take over the field of government entirely. So the idea behind this book was to bring together a bunch of philosophers. These are philosophers, although they will make there are economic arguments and historical arguments in here, but they're not really economists and historians. It's mainly philosophers. The idea was to have 5 philosophers writing essays defending minarchism, 5 philosophers writing essays defending free market anarchism. That's not precisely how it worked out. That's the way it looks in the table of contents. You have 5 essays listed under minarchism and 5 essays listed under anarchism, but 2 of the minarchist essays are sort of complicated in ways that it's not clear what category they would belong to. So let me just sort of quickly run through what the 10 are, and I'm going to try to do this without looking at the table of contents. So the first essay in the minarchist section is by Lester Hunt, and it's not strictly a defense of either side in the debate. Instead, it's an exploration of the question, why would the state need a special defense? Why would you need a special justification for the state? It doesn't, there are lots of institutions around that, just sort of survive and people participate in them, and it's not clear that there needs to be any special, argument. If you see debates about, the justification of the supermarket or justification of a highway system or something like that. It's just, here's a convenient service, people use it. So why does the state need a justification? And in particular, why is it a worry, as it seems to be both for many anarchists and for many minarchists, why is it a worry if the state doesn't rest on consent, given that there are lots of institutions that don't rest on consent? I never consented to the institution of the state. I never consented to the institution of private property. I never consented to the existence of the institution of marriage. I never consented to the existence of supermarkets. So why is there a special problem here? Because the philosopher David Hume had pushed just this point. He said, what's this big deal about consenting to the state? Suppose you were to consent to the state. Why would you? Presumably because you find it convenient and it's useful for human life. Well, why isn't that then just the reason for the state? Why not just drop the stuff about consent and just say, whatever your reason is for consenting to the state, why not just make that the reason for the state? And of course, that again assumes that it is convenient and useful to human life to have the state. But Hume thinks if it is, you don't need any special argument for consent. Lester Hunt is trying to argue in that essay that there is a special problem with justifying the state. He's not saying that you can or that you can't do it, but that there are special reasons why you might think it needs a justification. The next essay is by Roger Lee, who unfortunately passed away just this past week. So this will be his final publication. He is defending minarchism. He defends the view that you can't have a coherent system of property rights without some kind of state to define them. In the absence of the state, you would have various sorts of assertions of claims, but they wouldn't rise to the level of being property rights. Then we have an essay by Adam Reed, which looks to, gives a kind of historical argument, points to the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And he argues that there was a period in the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth where it had many of the features that free market anarchists consider desirable. That in some sense there were these competing jurisdictions, competing protection agencies, or something very much like that, and that the whole thing turned out badly. It didn't work well. It didn't work as anarchists would hope or predict, and therefore it's kind of a historical, empirical argument against free market anarchism. The next essay is by William Thomas, who defends minarchism from an objectivist perspective, that is, from the perspective of the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and argues that society requires an objective code of law. An objective code of law cannot arise simply from competing firms on the free market. It requires some sort of overarching universal structure with some finality to it, and therefore that you can't have effective rights protection without a minimal state. The last essay in the minarchist section is the other minarchist essay that doesn't fit neatly into any one category. The last essay is by Tibor Machan himself, and it is presenting the view that the dichotomy between anarchism and minarchism is in some sense a false dichotomy, that really there isn't a fundamental distinction here. Some of you may have seen a bit of a go-around of a debate between, in the pages of JLS between Tibor and Walter Block on precisely this subject, where Tibor is arguing that strictly speaking, the service is a distinction without a difference, that it's reasonable to expect that certain sort of territorial natural monopolies would arise, whether you call it anarchism, whether you call it minarchism. He thinks it's not a big deal. In the second section of the book, the anarchist section, first up there's an essay by Ian Scoble using ideas of game theory and prisoner's dilemma to explain why he thinks that cooperation can be secured without a central body of enforcement. And this goes back to sort of one of the standard arguments for government. It's one that goes back to Thomas Hobbes, that cooperation will be unstable unless there's a central authority to enforce cooperation, because although we're all better off if we cooperate, it's not in anyone's interest to make the first move toward cooperation until they know that other people will cooperate first. And so unless there's some kind of central force to force everyone to cooperate, everyone's going to sort of refrain from cooperating until they know they can trust other people. And Ian argues that that's not the case, using some standard prisoner's dilemma game theory arguments. Then there's a piece by Jan Narveson defending a broadly contractarian approach to libertarianism, and arguing that on that approach you cannot justify having a state. You cannot justify it to the people whose right to opt out would be forbidden to them. There's another historically oriented essay, so it's sort of a nice sort of counterpoint to the Adam Reed one on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was by John Hassness. Some of you may have seen this already because there was a draft of it on the working paper site on the Mises Institute website, I believe. This one is called The Obviousness of Anarchy, typical John Hassness title. And he's talking about the history of the English common law and its remnants around us today. And he argues that the English common law was effectively the result of something like a free market anarchist process, that it was not the result of any kind of central authority, the result of competing jurisdictions and so on, and it's essentially a privately generated form of law. And so if you wonder, can the market generate effective law, he says, yeah, most of the law most of the best parts of the law that we have actually came out of that kind of process. Then there's an essay by me in which I try to argue that the standard defenses of constitutionalism actually turn out to be, in a way, arguments for a kind of anarchism, or that anarchism can be seen as a form of constitutionalism. It can be seen as a form of checks and balances. Not as a written constitution, but simply a written constitution isn't all that much. I mean, the Soviet Constitution had rights of free speech and free press and the right to organize labor unions and various sorts of things the Soviet Constitution guaranteed, which in practice were not abided by because it was simply a list of written guarantees. So what you need is a incentive structure. You need to have the legal system in such a way that the different parts can sort of check and balance each other and so on, rather than simply having a written list of stuff. And I argue that you can see anarchism as simply pushing the notion of checks and balances to the logical extreme. And in that essay, I try to take on an argument you often see to the effect that anarchism won't be effective because you need a final arbiter in disputes. There needs to be a court of last resort. Whereas you've just got lots of competing firms, and there's no final court of last resort. And I try to argue that the notion of a final arbiter or a final authority is ambiguous, that if you take it to mean some sort of absolute, perfect, guaranteed finality, then anarchism doesn't have it, but neither does any other system. And if instead you mean something like good enough finality in practice, then other systems have that, but anarchy can have that too. Finally, there's an essay by Charles Johnson in which he tries to defend anarchy by sort of three lines of argument, one focusing on sort of executive, one legislative, and one judicial aspects of anarchy. And then he also tries to integrate a defense of anarchism with a defense of values that are often not associated with, in people's minds, with free market libertarianism, namely the values of what he calls equality and solidarity. And he argues that solidarity is sort of the non-sexist version of fraternity. Think of sort of the liberty, equality, fraternity as being the three watchwords of the French Revolution. People thought, well, often you have to choose among them. If you choose liberty, then you go off in the direction of being a libertarian. If you choose equality, you go off in the direction of being a socialist. If you choose fraternity, you go off in the direction of being some sort of communitarian. And he suggests that properly understood, libertarian theory can reconcile all of those. So that's what the book's about. Questions? Yes?
In your view, is there any moral foundation for the existence of the state, if there is any?
No, I'm on the anarchist side. This was edited by one anarchist and one minarchist. Well, it's not clear whether Tibor's a minarchist because he wants to say that his view is sort of a compromise between anarchism and minarchism. But he put himself in the minarchist portion of the book, and that seems right to me too. But I'm defending the anarchist side.
May I suggest one?
Pardon?
May I suggest one reason, perhaps, to defend or assure the working of the visible hand of the market, using the metaphor of Adam Smith? If there is no state at all, how can you assure that everybody looking after his own interests serve the interests of others?
Well, I mean, Adam Smith's invisible hand isn't directed by the state. I mean, the whole point of Adam Smith's invisible hand is that people pursuing their own individual self-interest just leads to social order. So the worry that this kind of spontaneous order needs to be, needs the state to make it happen seems like more that's an argument for a visible hand, not an invisible one.
But given the human nature as it is, someone in the division of labor must take care of protecting the rights of others and these others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, but anarchists and minarchists agree on that. The question is whether the protection of rights should be a competitive enterprise that anyone can enter, or whether it should be reserved to a monopoly. And then the anarchist argument is going to be precisely because of human nature. If you have monopolies tend to be abused, because if you're a monopoly, you're in a position to abuse your power. So there's sort of incentive problems with monopoly. Then also there are sort of, broadly speaking, informational problems with monopoly. If you've got a monopoly, even if you have the best intentions in the world, it's hard to know whether you're doing things the most efficient way. It's hard to know whether you're pricing your services appropriately and so forth, because there's no market for comparison. So for both incentival and informational reasons, the anarchist is going to say that that having a free market in competition in protective services is safer than having a monopoly. Of course, the minarchist is going to say, well, you're assuming that the market mechanism is going to work the same way, but what if the market mechanism requires a background structure of law already in place in order for it to work? If that's the case, then the legal structure couldn't itself be the result of economic competition because it's already presupposed. And I tried to argue against that in my article, but obviously there's a lot to be said on both sides of this.
I'm sort of enticed by the word mini-archism.
It's just minarchism. There's no second I.
What's the origin of the word?
I believe that it was Samuel Konkin who coined the term. It's a term with a Latin prefix and a Greek suffix, which means that there's reason. So some of the some purists might think that's a reason not to form such a word. There's a kind of idea that maybe you shouldn't combine Latin prefix and Greek suffix, but Sam Konkin did it. So at least I'm pretty sure that he was the one. He was the one who founded a tradition of libertarianism called agorism, agorism, which comes from the Greek word for market. He was an anarchist, but he thought he should have some word for the people that he was arguing against, and I suppose he could have called them miniature statists or something like that. But he was polite enough to come up with a term that didn't seem too derogatory, and so I'm pretty sure he's the one who coined that term. You also see people, advocates of the minimal state, advocates of limited government. Those are also used as sort of broadly synonyms, although there's disagreement about, some people think limited government is a broader concept than minarchism, perhaps. You just how limited? In some sense, all government is limited, thankfully. Yeah.
You may answer this question when they go read the book, but I'm curious about this, the first essay in the anarchism section where the author is advocating, I guess, talking about game theory and the prisoner's dilemma, which is so often used as a justification for the state, and I find it intriguing that this author is sort of turning it around. And I'm curious as to, can you just briefly summarize what his point is in that? Because I'm familiar with this prisoner's dilemma.
Well, and one of the things that he draws on is, so I can direct you to I can selflessly direct you to a cheaper book by Robert Axelrod, Axelrod, called The Evolution of Cooperation. And there were several works along those lines, but that's one of the sort of the most popular one, in which he argues that when people use this idea of a prisoner's dilemma is any case where you have to decide whether to cooperate with someone else or not, and they have to decide whether to cooperate with you or not, where it seems as though for each of you, your favorite option would be that they cooperate and you don't. Your second favorite would be you both cooperate. Your third favorite would be neither one cooperates, and your least favorite would be you cooperate and they don't, and so you're a sucker. And one standard argument, especially popular with, say, economists, for the state is, or for some kind of coerced cooperation, is to say, well, look, if I'm trying to figure out what the best thing is for me to do, I think, well, if you're going to cooperate, then my cooperating will get me my second favorite option, and my not cooperating will get me my first favorite option. So if you're going to cooperate, I shouldn't. But if you're not going to cooperate, then my cooperating will get me my least favorite option, and my not will get me my second least. And so whatever you're going to do, I'm better off not cooperating. You reason the same way. We both fail to cooperate, and therefore we both end up at our third favorite option. Whereas if we both cooperated, we would have been better off. So our own rational self-interest has somehow led us systematically to this lower off condition. So the argument is, therefore, you need the state to come along and force people to cooperate. And what Axelrod says is, well, look, that argument, if it works only when you're thinking about just interacting with a person one time. But if you think about interacting with people over a period of time, where what you do in one interaction affects what they're likely to do in the next interaction, people who gain a reputation for being cooperative, or for being cooperative until the other side zaps them, tend to attract more cooperators. And so then Axelrod gives this argument, in the abstract and game theory and with computer simulations and so forth, but he also runs through various real-life cases, including in cases in World War I trench warfare, where there were times where each side would simply refuse to shoot at the other because they knew as long as they kept refusing to shoot at the other wouldn't shoot at them. And because they were sort of in these trenches facing each other for long periods of time, it wasn't like just sort of suddenly encountering someone on the battlefield where it might be reasonable, you better shoot them first because they're probably going to shoot you. But when you have these people sort of interacting over a long period of time and people begin knowing what to expect, these patterns of cooperation emerged in perhaps the most unlikely context for cooperation to emerge. People facing each other in a battlefield, they're supposed to be shooting each other, they can't even communicate directly, they don't speak the same language, and yet this cooperation emerged. So he gives historical examples and as well as sort of theoretical examples. He also gives some sort of examples that from a libertarian standpoint might be more depressing, such as the evolution of cooperation within Congress, where he argues that over time, members of Congress have learned more how to cooperate with each other. I'll support your crazy bill if you'll support my crazy bill, and so forth. And so he argues that over time, conflict in Congress tends to decrease as there's more and more sort of inter-party cooperation. Anyway, so that's a good book, and it's that kind of research that Scoble is drawing on. Yeah, Larry.
Yes, sir. Many minarchists that I've dealt with over the years seem to...
You can already tell which side he's on, right?
Tell it like it is. Hey, why not? Seem to, as a core proposition, seem to have the idea, or I say seem simply because sometimes they fit locally, but not usually, that there must be a mature, fully functioning legal system as a prerequisite, temporal prerequisite, to markets development. I've encountered that many times in various forms, and I'm sure you have as well. And that's always struck me as very ahistorical. For one thing, it seemed to me that, particularly in the high Middle Ages or the development, when capitalism was on the cusp, so to speak, they were developing together. Any comments about that issue about the pre-existing condition and the historical fact?
I mean, that in fact, that is one of the things I talk about in my essay. Is
good for you.
This idea that a functioning market presupposes a legal order. Now, there's a sense in which it's true, in the sense that, in some sense you can't have a functioning market in some sense without a legal order, but you can't have a legal order without a functioning market, because the people who are enforcing the law have to eat. And so there has to be some sort of production and exchange going on in order to fund a legal order to begin with. So of course the two arise together. And one of the points I want to make is that I think there's a tendency for many minarchists to think of the legal order as something sort of external to people's actions, interactions. There's this thing out there, like there's this robot out there that's programmed to enforce our rights. And if it goes away, then we're all in chaos. But as long as there's this robot there, it will sort of constrain us. But the problem is there's no robot. It's just more of us guys. And the existence of governments depends on cooperation, both of cooperation of people within the government with each other and of cooperation between the government and the people they're supposed to be ruling. And that cooperation can't be somehow solely the result of government, since it enters into the very constitution of there being a government in the first place. So if some sort of external force was necessary in order to make people cooperate, you couldn't have government. Actually, this point like this was made by Alfred Kuzan in a JLS article back in the 70s, I think, called "Do We Ever Really Get Out of Anarchy?" Where he says, if you think that people can't cooperate unless there's a central force over them to make them cooperate, what makes the people in the government cooperate? You've got to have another one above it, and so on. You've got to have an infinite hierarchy of governments all the way up in order to make everyone cooperate. And that doesn't seem to be true. Yeah.
It seems to me you can't discuss government without discussing taxes. Which comes first? You can't have government without taxes, and therefore, how do you get to government without first doing something that's quite immoral? Initiating force without any justification to acquire the taxes to create the government.
There's a dispute among minarchists as to whether taxation is a legitimate function of government or not. Those in the Randian tradition often want to say that you can have a government that forbids competition in the provision of legal services, but then nevertheless it won't tax. And there's dispute about whether that's possible or not, and why you would object to the taxation but not to the prohibition of competition and so forth. But there is that line of argument. So the Randians, for example, tend to be very annoyed at Rothbard, because Rothbard usually defines the state as having two things: a monopoly in sort of coercive defensive rights and a power to tax. And the Randians say, well, there's no necessity for those two to go together. They do empirically seem to, but in some sense, taxation is in some sense more widespread in that it's hard to find any institution that claims the kind of monopoly government has but that doesn't tax. But there are lots of organizations that tax without having that kind of monopoly. They kind of just come up to you and grab your wallet. So in some sense, taxation may be sort of logically prior to government. So you start off sort of freelance taxing, and then gradually you get more and more organized. How are we doing? Okay.
Roderick, do any of the essays speak to voluntary servitude, Lavoisier's concept of why is it that so many humans, as we look around, appear to just simply want to be enslaved and desire this state?
I think mine and Johnson's both, at least to some extent, talk about this idea. I mean, Etienne de la Boétie had this idea, and I'm not mispronouncing it. That's how he really would have pronounced it, even though that's not how it would be pronounced in French today. Etienne de la Boétie had this says, and he makes this point that all government, in some sense, rests on consent, in the sense that the governments are always a small minority. They couldn't simply, by their own personal force, subdue everyone else without people's acquiescence, and so all government rests to some extent on people's acquiescence. And sort of Boétie's answer was they do two things. First of all, they sort of, this group sort of buys off the layer below it, who sort of buys off the layer below it, and so forth. There's various systems of patronage and so forth. Although the farther down you go, the less they're really getting out of it in the long run, but so they think they are. And second, propaganda, the conviction, and Johnson talks about this a bit. The conviction that the state is more than just some ordinary institution, that it's somehow the representative of the people, kind of sort of a mystical unity of the people, this kind of thing that gives it a certain kind of legitimacy and also creates the illusion that it can do things it really can't do, that it can somehow guarantee our cooperation as though it were some sort of external force acting on us, as opposed to simply being maintained in existence by the things we do. Well, I think thank you. Thank you.